The silence in the sterling penthouse was a living thing, a heavy blanket woven from grief and polished marble. It clung to the floor-to-ceiling windows that stared out over the glittering, indifferent city, and it pooled in the hollows of Julian Sterling's face. From her corner, dusting a sculpture that cost more than her entire life, Elara Vance watched him. She had been his late wife's personal maid, and after Amelia's sudden passing 6 months ago, she had been kept on. A ghost in a crisp grey uniform, tidying up the wreckage of a man's heart. Julian was a shell. The dynamic, ruthless CEO who commanded boardrooms with a flick of his wrist was gone, replaced by a man who moved through his own home like a trespasser. His world had shrunk to the confines of this glass cage in the sky, and the only colour in it was Isabella Croft. Isabella, his fiancée. She had appeared like a vibrant, exotic flower in the monochrome garden of Julian's morning. With her fiery hair, her laughter that tinkled like expensive crystal, and her declarations of undying love, she had convinced everyone she was the cure. Everyone but Elara. Elara saw the flicker of calculation in Isabella's eyes when Julian wasn't looking. She saw the way her perfectly manicured hand tightened on his arm, less a gesture of affection and more one of ownership. And she saw the nightly ritual. Every evening, at precisely 10 o'clock, Isabella would prepare Julian's special tonic, a concoction of herbs and vitamins, she'd claimed, prescribed by a niche European doctor to help with his grief and insomnia. She would brew it herself in the secondary kitchen, refusing any help. Her movements secretive and precise. She would bring it to him in a small, ornate porcelain cup, coaxing him to drink it down with honeyed words. But Elara noticed things. She noticed how, after drinking the tonic, Julian's melancholy didn't lift, but deepened, settling into a fog of confusion that often lasted through the next morning. She noticed the faint, almost imperceptible tremor that had started in his hands. And one evening, while clearing the cup, she'd seen a tiny crystalline residue at the bottom, something that didn't look like any herb she knew. Her suspicion began as a whisper, a cold dread that coiled in her stomach. She started watching Isabella more closely. She saw the discreet deliveries from unregulated online pharmacies, the hushed, angry phone calls Isabella would take on the balcony, her voice a venomous hiss. One afternoon, while Isabella was out, a desperate curiosity drove Elara to the secondary kitchen. Tucked away at the back of a spice drawer, behind jars of saffron and vanilla pods, she found a small dark glass vial with a label she couldn't read. It was almost empty. That night, she watched as Isabella prepared the tonic. From the shadows of the hallway, she saw her produce the same vial, tipping the last few precious drops into the porcelain cup before hiding it away. A cold certainty washed over Elara. This wasn't medicine. This was a slow, methodical execution. Isabella wasn't healing Julian, she was erasing him. She was a predator, patiently waiting for her prey to weaken, to sign over the last of his controls, to finally succumb so she could inherit an empire. Tonight was different. Julian had spent the day in a rare meeting with his lawyers, something about finalizing changes to his will. Isabella had been vibrating with a tense, triumphant energy all evening. Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the dose in tonight's cup would be the final one. She had no proof, not really. Just a maid's observation, an empty vial, and a terrible gut feeling. Who would believe her over the beautiful, doting fiancée? She was trapped. She could do nothing and watch a good man die, or she could do the unthinkable. The air in the grand living room crackled with an unspoken tension. Julian sat slumped in his favorite leather armchair, his gaze lost somewhere in the city lights beyond the glass. He looked older than his 38 years, the sharp lines of his face softened by a weariness that seemed to seep from his very bones. Isabella glided towards him, the porcelain cup held carefully in her hands, her silk robe whispering against the marble floor. "Here you are, my love," she cooed, her voice a perfect symphony of concern and affection. "Your tonic. It will help you rest. You've had such a stressful day." Elara stood by the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her mind raced, sifting through 100 useless plans. Scream, accuse. They would call security. She would be dismissed as a hysterical, jealous servant. She needed to stop him from drinking it right now before that cup touched his lips. Julian reached for the cup, his hand trembling slightly. "Thank you, Isabella. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," she murmured, her smile a predatory curve. That was it. The finality in her tone, the glint of victory in her eyes. It was now or never. Ilara moved. She didn't think, she reacted. A primal scream of no tore from her throat as she launched herself across the room. She was a blur of grey uniform and desperate resolve. She didn't aim for the cup. She aimed for the space between them, a chaotic force meant to disrupt the fatal transaction. Her hand slapped out, connecting with Isabella's wrist. The porcelain cup flew through the air, a white comet trailing a dark, herbal-scented liquid. It shattered against the far wall with a sharp crack, the sound echoing the breaking of a spell. Isabella shrieked, a sound of pure fury. "What is the meaning of this, you lunatic?" Julian, startled from his stupor, stared at Ilara with wide, uncomprehending eyes. He saw the shattered cup, the dark stain spreading on the wall, and the wild, terrified look on his maid's face. His first instinct was confusion, then a surge of anger. "Ilara, what have you done?" he demanded, his voice raspy. But his hand, almost by reflex, moved to pick up a large, jagged shard of the broken cup from the floor, perhaps to examine the residue. The liquid on it was still wet. "Don't touch it," Ilara yelled, her voice raw with panic. He ignored her, his brow furrowed as he brought the shard closer to his face. In that split second, Ilara saw his finger drift towards the liquid, his instinct to taste or smell the strange substance. She saw Isabella's triumphant smirk. He was going to poison himself anyway. Without a second thought, she lunged again. There was no time for words, no time for explanation. There was only time for action. Her fist, clenched tight with all the fear and desperation she felt, swung out. It wasn't a calculated blow, but a frantic, clumsy, powerful impact. Her knuckles connected squarely with Julian Sterling's jaw. The sound was a sickening thud. The force of the blow snapped his head to the side. The shard of porcelain clattered from his grasp onto the floor. He staggered back a step, his eyes wide with shock and pain, a hand flying to his face. A stunned, absolute silence descended upon the room, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. Ilara Vance, the quiet maid, had just punched her billionaire boss in the face. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, ready to shatter. Ilara's arm throbbed, the shock of the impact vibrating all the way to her shoulder. She stood frozen, her chest heaving, her knuckles already starting to swell. The enormity of her action crashed down on her. She hadn't just crossed a line, she had obliterated it. Julian stared at her, his expression a maelstrom of confusion, pain and disbelief. A dark red bloom was already starting to form on his jawline, but it was Isabella who broke the spell. "Security!" she shrieked, her voice a piercing, venomous thing. "Security! Get this violent creature out of here. She attacked us. She attacked Julian." She rushed to Julian's side, her hands fluttering over him, playing the part of the distraught fiancée to perfection. "Oh, darling, are you all right?" "That maniac. She tried to hurt you. We have to call the police. She needs to be locked away." Two broad-shouldered men in dark suits appeared in the doorway almost instantly, their faces grim and professional. They took in the scene, their boss clutching his jaw, his furious fiancée pointing a trembling finger, and the maid standing pale and defiant in the center of the room. "Sir?" the head of security, a man named Marcus, asked, his eyes fixed on Julian. Julian didn't answer. He didn't even look at Marcus. His gaze was locked on Ilara, and for the first time in months, the fog in his eyes seemed to be clearing, replaced by a sharp, analytical light. The physical shock of the punch had been like a bucket of ice water to his system. He was processing. The scream, the shattered cup, the desperate, frantic punch. It didn't add up to a simple assault. It was an act of extreme, irrational intervention. "Why?" "She's insane," Isabella spat, grabbing Julian's arm. "She's been obsessed with you for months. I've seen the way she looks at you. This is some twisted fantasy of hers. Get her out." "Is that true, Ilara?" Julian's voice was low, rough, each word seemingly a painful effort. "Are you insane?" Ilara's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but his direct question cut through it. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and unwavering. "No, Mr. Sterling, I am not." "Then explain yourself," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You have 10 seconds before I let Marcus handle this." "The tonic," Ilara said, her voice shaking but firm. "The tonic she gives you every night. It's not medicine, it's poison." A gasp escaped Isabella. It was a masterful performance of shock and hurt. "Poison? How dare you?" "Julian, she's making up the most wicked, vile lies. I brought that tonic from the finest apothecary in Geneva. It's to help you." "She's been poisoning you slowly for months," Ilara pressed on, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Making you weak, confused. So you would sign everything over to her. The will you signed today. That's what she was waiting for. Tonight's dose was the last one. It was meant to kill you." Julian's eyes flickered from Ilara's earnest, terrified face to Isabella's outraged one. His mind, sharpened by the adrenaline, was racing, connecting dots he hadn't even realized were there. The persistent fog, the tremors, his increasing reliance on Isabella for even the simplest decisions. "You have no proof," Isabella sneered, her confidence returning. "It's the word of a deranged maid against your loving fiancé. Who are you going to believe, Julian? Her or me?" She wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing a kiss to his uninjured cheek. "Tell them to take her away, my love. Let's put this ugliness behind us." Julian looked at Isabella, truly looked at her. He saw the possessive glint in her eyes, the slight tremor of rage in her perfectly painted lips. And he remembered something. A conversation from a week ago. He'd complained about the bitter aftertaste of the tonic. Isabella had laughed it off, saying, "It's the oleander extract, darling. Terribly bitter but wonderfully effective for the heart." He hadn't thought anything of it. But his late wife, Amelia, had been a botanist. He remembered her walking him through their garden, pointing to a beautiful bush with vibrant pink flowers. "Stay away from that one, Julian," she had warned playfully. "It's Nerium oleander. Every part of it is beautiful, and every part of it is deadly poison." The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. Oleander. His gaze dropped to the floor, to the dark liquid seeping into the grout between the marble tiles. He looked at the shattered shard he had almost touched to his tongue. He looked back at Ilara, who stood her ground, awaiting her fate, having risked everything on the belief that he was a man worth saving. And then he looked at Isabella, who was smiling at him, a confident, predatory smile that no longer looked like love. It looked like triumph. Everything clicked into place. The lies, the manipulation, the slow, creeping illness. It was all real. The woman in his arms was not his savior. She was his assassin. And the woman standing across the room, the one who had just assaulted him, was the only person who had tried to save his life. A cold, pure rage, unlike anything he had ever felt, rose up inside him. It was a cleansing fire, burning away the grief, the confusion, the weakness. He gently unwrapped Isabella's arms from his neck. His movements were calm, deliberate. He turned to face her fully. "You were right," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Isabella's smile widened. "Of course I was, darling. Now, about her—" He didn't let her finish. His hand came up, not in a fist, but open-palmed. The crack of the slap was like a gunshot in the silent room. It was not a wild, uncontrolled strike, but a precise, cold, and final act of judgment. Isabella's head snapped to the side, a perfect red imprint of his hand blooming on her cheek, a mirror to the bruise on his own jaw. She staggered back, her eyes wide with disbelief and fury, a hand flying to her face. The mask was gone. All the feigned love and concern had vanished, replaced by the raw, ugly face of her true nature. You hit me," she whispered, her voice trembling with shock. "Get out," Julian said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "Marcus," the head of security stepped forward. "Sir, escort Ms. Croft from the premises. She is to take nothing but the clothes on her back. Her access is revoked. If she ever sets foot on any Sterling property again, have her arrested for trespassing." "Julian, you can't do this," Isabella shrieked, her composure shattering completely. "We're engaged. I love you." "The only thing you love is my money," Julian said, his voice like ice, "and you were willing to kill me for it. You should be grateful I'm not having you arrested for attempted murder. It would be a messy public affair, and frankly, you're not worth the effort. Now get out of my sight." Marcus and the other guard took Isabella by the arms. She struggled, screaming threats and curses, her elegant facade reduced to that of a common shrew. As they dragged her towards the elevator, her venomous words echoed back into the room. But Julian didn't even watch her go. He stood in the center of the silent room, the scene of his own near assassination. He was alone with the woman who had saved him. He turned slowly to face Ilara. She hadn't moved, her eyes wide, watching the drama unfold. She looked small and terrified, yet she possessed a strength he hadn't seen in anyone else. He walked over to a small biometric safe set flush against the wall, disguised as a panel. He pressed his thumb to it. It hissed open. Inside were documents, a few pieces of jewelry, and a single heavy black keycard, alongside a set of ornate, old-fashioned brass keys. He took them out. He walked back to Ilara and stopped in front of her. He looked at her swollen knuckles, then into her frightened eyes. He saw no triumph there, only relief and exhaustion. "I don't know your last name," he said quietly. It's Vance, sir. Ilara Vance." "Ilara Vance," he repeated, the name feeling solid and real on his tongue. He held out the keycard and the brass keys. "I don't know who I can trust anymore. My board, my family, my friends. She fooled all of them. But she didn't fool you. You saw the truth, and you did. This." He gestured to his bruised jaw, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You risked everything." Ilara just stared at the objects in his hand, confused. "Sir, I don't understand." "This card," he said, tapping the black plastic, "is the master key to every office, lab, and facility owned by Sterling Enterprises worldwide. This," he continued, holding up the brass keys, "opens this penthouse and the original Sterling family estate upstate. They represent total access, total control. They are the keys to my city, my entire world." He pressed them into her trembling hand, his fingers closing hers around the cool metal and plastic. "From this moment on," Julian Sterling said, his voice raw with a newfound conviction, "I'm putting my world in your hands. You're the only one I trust, not to burn it down." The weight of the keys in Ilara's hand felt impossible, heavier than metal and plastic had any right to be. One moment she was a maid, braced for arrest. The next, she was the custodian of an empire. The whiplash was dizzying. Julian Sterling stood before her, the bruise on his jaw a stark reminder of her violent intervention, yet his eyes held no anger. They held a terrifying clarity and an even more terrifying trust. "Sir, Mr. Sterling, I can't," she stammered, trying to push the keys back towards him. "I'm a maid. I dust your shelves. I don't run companies." "And I," he countered, his voice low and intense, "am a fool who almost drank poison from the hand of the woman I was going to marry. My judgment is compromised. My inner circle is compromised. Isabella was a viper I welcomed into my bed. Who else is there? Who did she talk to? Who helped her? I don't know, but I know you. I know you saw what everyone else missed, and you had the courage to act when no one else would have. That's better judgment than anyone on my board has shown in the last year." He wouldn't take the keys back. His hand remained at his side, resolute. The penthouse, which had felt so vast and empty moments before, now seemed to shrink around them, the silence charged with the gravity of his decision. The security chief, Marcus, still stood discreetly by the door, his face an impassive mask, but Ilara could feel his stunned gaze on her. What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For now, stay," he said simply. "I need someone here who isn't lying to me. I need a pair of eyes that sees things as they are. The guest wing is yours. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." He finally seemed to register his own exhaustion, swaying slightly on his feet. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the raw ache of betrayal and the lingering effects of months of being slowly poisoned. "I need to call my doctor, a real one, and my lawyer." He turned and walked towards his study, his steps unsteady but purposeful. He was a man pulling himself back from the brink, and he had, in a desperate act of faith, made her his anchor. Ilara looked down at the keys again. The city keys. It was an absurd, melodramatic title, yet it felt chillingly accurate. She had access to the heart of Julian Sterling's power. The next few days were a blur. Julian was confined to the penthouse under the care of a trusted physician who confirmed his system was riddled with toxins consistent with oleander poisoning. The diagnosis was a grim validation of Ilara's actions. A team of forensic accountants and security specialists descended upon the Sterling empire, all reporting not to the board, but directly to a secure laptop Julian had set up for Ilara in her new suite. Her life transformed overnight. The grey uniform was replaced by clothes Julian's personal shopper delivered, simple, elegant pieces that felt like a costume. She no longer dusted furniture. She sat in Julian's state-of-the-art office, fielding calls from bewildered executives and flagging suspicious transactions. She was a ghost in the machine, her name suddenly attached to high-level security clearances, her voice an unknown but absolute authority. The resistance was immediate and palpable. Julian's executive assistant, a polished and territorial woman named Claire, treated Ilara with icy contempt. "Mr. Sterling has requested you review these quarterly reports," Claire would say, her tone implying Ilara wouldn't understand the first page. Members of the board, old money patriarchs who had known Julian since he was a boy, made condescending calls, referring to her as the girl and demanding to speak to Julian directly. Ilara was drowning. She was armed with Julian's trust and a sharp mind, but she knew nothing of corporate finance or hostile takeovers. She spent her nights poring over files, teaching herself the language of this new world, fueled by coffee and a terrifying sense of responsibility. She wasn't just protecting a man anymore, she was protecting thousands of jobs, a legacy. It was during one of these late-night sessions, sifting through Isabella's seized financials, that she found the first thread. A series of large, untraceable cash withdrawals. They were small enough to fly under the radar, but consistent. Too consistent. On a hunch, she cross-referenced the dates with Isabella's calendar. Every withdrawal corresponded with a notation. Lunch with D. There was no D in Isabella's public circle of friends. Ilara dug deeper, pulling security logs from Julian's office building. On the days of Lunch with D, Isabella hadn't left the building. Instead, the visitor logs showed a recurring guest for another top-level executive. Mr. David Chen, a senior board member and Julian's father's oldest friend. Uncle David, as Julian had always called him. A cold dread settled over Ilara. David was a fixture, a man of unimpeachable integrity who had been instrumental in guiding Julian after his father's death. He had been one of the most vocal supporters of Julian's engagement to Isabella, praising her as a breath of fresh air. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. Was the rot not just on the outside, but deep within the foundation of the Sterling family itself? She printed the records, her hands shaking slightly. This was a landmine. Accusing a man like David Chen, based on a lunch date and a calendar initial, was career suicide, even for someone with the boss's absolute trust. Presenting this to Julian, a man already shattered by one betrayal, could destroy what was left of him. She took the files and walked towards Julian's private wing. He was awake, sitting by the window, looking stronger than he had in days. The toxins were clearing, and the fire was returning to his eyes. "What is it, Ilara?" he asked, sensing her hesitation. She laid the files on the table in front of him. I think Isabella had a partner." He read through the documents, his expression hardening with each page. He saw the withdrawal slips, the calendar entries, the visitor logs. When he looked up, his face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes were filled with a profound, soul-deep pain. "David," he breathed, the name like a curse. "He introduced me to her." The puzzle pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. David passed over for the CEO position in favor of Julian years ago. David, who had been quietly selling off his Sterling stock for the past 6 months. David, who stood to gain immense power in the chaos of Julian's death, likely installed as the new CEO by a grateful board. Isabella wasn't the mastermind. She was the weapon. David was the assassin. "He's chairing the emergency board meeting tomorrow morning," Julian said, his voice dangerously low. "They've been trying to get me to cede temporary control, citing my health crisis. David has been leading the charge." "What are you going to do?" Ilara asked. Julian looked at her, and a slow, grim smile touched his lips. He thinks he's walking into a coronation. But he's walking into an execution. And you, he said, his gaze intense, are going to be right there with me. The Sterling Enterprises boardroom was a cathedral of corporate power. A long obsidian table reflected the moody sky outside, and the chairs around it were filled with the most influential figures in the city's financial landscape. At the head of the table sat David Chen, his expression a carefully crafted mask of somber concern. He looked every bit the elder statesman, the steady hand ready to guide the ship through a storm. As you all know, David began, his voice resonating with false gravity, we are here today because of Julian's unfortunate and sudden health decline. It is with a heavy heart that I must propose we vote on instituting the emergency succession protocol. For the good of the company, we need to appoint an interim CEO until Julian is well enough to return. He let the words hang in the air, the implication clear. A murmur of agreement went around the table. The board was primed. David had spent weeks sowing seeds of doubt about Julian's stability, his grief making him erratic. Isabella's carefully leaked concerns had done the rest. I believe the vote will be a mere formality, David said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. All in favor of invoking the succession protocol? Hands began to rise around the table. I vote against it. The voice, clear and strong, came from the grand double doors at the end of the boardroom. They swung open, and Julian Sterling walked in. He was not the broken, grief-stricken man they had been led to expect. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his jawline sharp. The bruise from Ilara's punch, now a faint yellowish mark of a battle won. His eyes were cold and clear, sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members. And walking beside him, her expression calm and composed, was Ilara Vance. She carried a slim leather portfolio and moved with a quiet confidence that made her presence an undeniable statement. The sight of the CEO, presumed to be on his deathbed, striding in with a woman none of them recognized as anything more than household staff, sent a wave of shock through the room. David Chen's face went pale. The carefully constructed mask of concern slipped, revealing a flicker of pure panic before it was quickly schooled back into place. Julian, he exclaimed, rising to his feet, my boy, we were so worried. We didn't expect to see you here. You should be resting. I've rested enough, David, Julian said, his voice like chips of ice. He walked to his rightful place at the head of the table, opposite David. Ilara stood just behind his right shoulder, a silent, watchful guardian. I understand you were about to hold a vote in my absence. How very proactive of you. The air in the room was thick with tension. The board members lowered their hands, their expressions shifting from concern to confusion and apprehension. We were only acting in the company's best interest, another board member, Arthur Harrington, stammered. Were you? Julian's gaze was sharp as a razor. Or were you acting on the misinformation you've been fed for months? Lies about my health, my stability. Lies that, I've discovered, originated from a very specific source. He paused, letting his accusation hang in the air. He looked directly at David Chen. It's amazing what you can learn when you stop drinking poison every night. A collective gasp went through the room. David's composure finally cracked. Poison? Julian, what nonsense is this? Your grief is making you paranoid. Is it? Julian's voice was dangerously soft. He nodded to Ilara. She stepped forward and opened the portfolio. With calm, deliberate movements, she placed a series of documents in the center of the obsidian table. A medical report from Julian's physician detailing the oleander toxicity. Bank statements showing the cash withdrawals from Isabella's account. Visitor logs from the building. And finally, a printed transcript of a phone call. My fiancée, Isabella Croft, was attempting to murder me, Julian announced to the silent room. And she had help. Someone who introduced me to her. Someone who coached her, someone who stood to gain everything from my death. Ilara pressed a button on a small digital recorder. Isabella's voice filled the room, frantic and shrill. It was the recording of the call she'd made right after being thrown out of the penthouse. David, it all went wrong. The maid, she knew. He knows everything. He threw me out. You have to do something. Our plan is ruined. David Chen's face turned the color of ash. He stared at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. The entire board was frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief, staring at the man they had trusted for decades. "The call was made from a burner phone," Elara said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the stunned silence. "But we were able to trace the cell tower signal it connected to. The receiver of the call was standing on the corner of 5th and 58th, right outside this building, less than 5 minutes after Ms. Croft was escorted out." She looked directly at David. "Where were you at 10:45 p.m. last Tuesday, Mr. Chen?" David shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is preposterous. A fabrication. You can't prove a thing." "Oh, I think we can," Julian said, his voice cold as a grave. "Isabella was quite cooperative once my lawyers explained the difference between a comfortable exile and a life sentence for conspiracy to commit murder. She's given a full confession, naming you as the architect of the entire plan. The SEC will be very interested in your recent stock-selling activities as well. It seems you are cashing out, getting ready to take the throne." Every eye in the room was now on David, a jury delivering a silent verdict. The man who had been a titan of industry moments before now seemed to shrink, the weight of his treachery crushing him. His face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, aimed not at Julian, but at Elara. "You," he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at her. "The maid, this is all because of you." "Yes," Julian said, stepping slightly to shield Elara from his gaze. "It is. Ms. Vance is the only person in the last 6 months who has demonstrated unwavering loyalty and impeccable judgment. Which is why I'm making this announcement. Effective immediately, I am creating a new executive position at Sterling Enterprises, Chief of Staff. All departmental reports, all strategic initiatives, all security protocols will cross her desk before they reach mine. Her authority is my authority." He looked around the table at the stunned faces of the board members. "Ms. Vance has been given the keys to the city, gentlemen. I suggest you get used to it. As for you, David," Julian's gaze returned to his father's oldest friend. "Security is waiting for you outside. Don't worry, I won't have you dragged out like Isabella. You can have the dignity of walking out on your own. But if you are not out of this building in 5 minutes, I will personally hand-deliver these files to the district attorney." David Chen stared at Julian, his chest heaving, his life's ambition turning to dust around him. Without another word, he turned and walked stiffly out of the boardroom, a man walking to his own execution. The doors closed behind him, leaving a profound and ringing silence. Julian Sterling stood at the head of the table, no longer a victim, but a king who had reclaimed his throne. He looked at Elara, and in front of the entire board, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of respect, of gratitude, of partnership. The maid had not only saved his life, she had helped him save his entire world. And in the silent, watchful eyes of the city's most powerful men, a new order had just been born. The weeks that followed the boardroom detonation were a trial by fire for Elara. Her new title, Chief of Staff, was met with a mixture of fear, resentment, and grudging respect. She was the woman who had stood beside Julian Sterling as he dismantled a legend. She was the maid who held the keys. The whispers followed her down the hallways of Sterling Tower, a constant reminder of her impossible journey. She moved out of the penthouse guest suite and into her own apartment. A sleek, minimalist space paid for by a salary that still made her feel dizzy. But she spent most of her waking hours in the office next to Julian's, a fortress of glass and steel high above the city. She became his shadow, his gatekeeper, and his most trusted advisor. She learned to read financial projections, to dissect legal jargon, and to identify the subtle currents of ambition and deceit in a room full of powerful men. Her relationship with Julian settled into a strange and intense rhythm. It was a partnership forged in crisis, devoid of the normal social graces. They worked side by side, often late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared, unspoken understanding. He trusted her instincts implicitly. If Elara felt something was wrong with a deal or a potential hire, he would kill it without a second thought. She, in turn, learned to understand his moods, to know when to push and when to give him space. There was a deep, unbreachable wall of professionalism between them, yet underneath it, something else was quietly growing. It was in the way he would look at her when she wasn't paying attention, a flicker of warmth and gratitude in his eyes. It was in the way she found herself worrying if he'd eaten, or if the lingering fatigue from the poisoning was getting worse. They were two lonely, wounded people who had found an unlikely sanctuary in each other's loyalty. Isabella Croft and David Chen vanished from their lives. Isabella, stripped of her assets, accepted a quiet exile in some forgotten European town, her name becoming a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. David, facing financial ruin and public disgrace, retired from society, a fallen king living in a self-imposed prison. The coup had been crushed. But the victory was not without its scars. Julian remained guarded, the betrayal having carved deep lines of mistrust into his soul. He kept the world at arm's length, his circle shrinking until it contained only one person, Ilara. One evening, they were the last two left in the executive suite. A storm was rolling in, and the city below was a tapestry of blurred, glittering lights through the rain-streaked windows. They had just averted another crisis, a hostile takeover attempt by a rival corporation that had tried to exploit the recent instability. It was Ilara who had spotted the unusual stock purchasing patterns, Ilara who had pieced together the strategy. "We make a good team," Julian said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. He was standing by the window, his back to her. "We do," she agreed, closing a file. He turned to face her. The office was dark, save for the ambient glow of the city. "I've never thanked you, Ilara, not properly. You gave me a job, Mr. Sterling, a life I never could have imagined. I think we're even." "Call me Julian," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "And no, we're not even. You gave me my life back. How do I repay that?" He took a step closer. The space between them, usually a safe, professional distance, suddenly felt charged, electric. Ilara's heart began to beat a little faster. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, see the exhaustion and something more vulnerable in his eyes. "You don't have to repay it," she said, her voice a little unsteady. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You did what no one else would have done. You punched your boss to stop him from drinking poison. You faced down a room full of men who could have crushed you without a thought. You are extraordinary." He was standing in front of her now, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before it gently touched her cheek. His thumb brushed over her skin, a touch so soft and tentative it made her breath catch in her throat. "I was in a fog for so long," he whispered, his gaze searching hers. "Grief, and then the poison. I couldn't see anything clearly. But I see you, Ilara. I see you." It was a confession, a question, a step across the invisible line that had separated them for months. All the loneliness, all the fear, all the shared battles of the past few months culminated in that single charged moment. The world outside, with its storms and its corporate predators, faded away. There was only the quiet hum of the building and the man in front of her, offering a piece of his shattered heart. Ilara didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, a silent answer to his unspoken question. For the first time, she allowed herself to see him, not as Mr. Sterling, the billionaire boss, but as Julian, the man she had saved, the man who, in turn, had saved her from a life of quiet obscurity. His other hand came up to cup her face, and he lowered his head, his eyes never leaving hers. The first kiss was not one of passion, but of profound, aching tenderness. It was a kiss of gratitude, of relief, of two survivors finding each other in the wreckage. It tasted of rain and coffee and the promise of a new beginning. In the heart of the city, in the glass tower that was his kingdom, Julian Sterling was finally letting someone in. And the maid who held the keys to his empire was discovering that she might just hold the key to his heart as well. The kiss changed everything and nothing. The next morning, they were back in the office, the wall of professionalism seemingly rebuilt. Mr. Sterling and Ms. Vance. But now a new current ran beneath the surface. A shared glance across the boardroom table held a different weight. A brief touch of hands as they passed a document lingered for a fraction of a second too long. They were navigating a new, uncharted territory, one far more complex than any corporate merger. The rest of the world, however, was not so subtle. The story of the maid who became the chief of staff was too delicious for the city's gossip columns to ignore. Ilara found her face splashed across tabloids, her life story dissected and embellished. She was painted as a cunning opportunist, a modern-day Cinderella, a corporate Mata Hari. The narrative was always the same. She had somehow seduced or tricked the grieving billionaire. Her intelligence and bravery were never part of the story. The scrutiny was relentless. Photographers followed her to her apartment. Old acquaintances sold fabricated stories to the press. She felt as though her identity was being stolen, replaced by a caricature she didn't recognize. The quiet strength that had allowed her to face down David Chen began to fray under the constant public assault. Julian was furious. He deployed the full force of his legal team, suing for libel and winning injunctions, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a fork. For every story they quashed, 2 more would spring up. "Don't let them get to you," he would tell her, his voice tight with anger. "They're gnats, insignificant." But they weren't insignificant to Ilara. She had lived her life in the quiet dignity of anonymity. This felt like a violation. She saw the way other executives looked at her now, their professional respect tainted by the whispers and headlines. She began to doubt herself. Was she really qualified for this job? Or was she just the recipient of a grateful man's extravagant whim? The final blow came from an unexpected direction. Amelia's parents, the late wife Julian had adored, requested a meeting with him. They had always been kind to Ilara when she was their daughter's maid, but their grief had made them distant since Amelia's death. Julian, feeling a duty to them, agreed to meet at the penthouse. He asked Ilara to be there. The elder Sterlings were polite but cold. After the initial pleasantries, Amelia's mother, a formidable woman named Catherine, turned her piercing gaze on Ilara. "We read the papers, of course," she began, her voice dripping with disapproval. "We dismissed it as tasteless gossip. But now, seeing you here, in our daughter's home, by Julian's side—" "Catherine, that's enough," Julian warned, his tone sharp. "No, it's not," she retorted, her composure cracking. "Amelia has been gone less than a year, and you've replaced her with the help. Do you have any idea how this looks? How it cheapens her memory?" The words struck Ilara like a physical slap. The help. In that one phrase, Catherine had stripped away her title, her accomplishments, her identity, and reduced her back to the grey uniform. "That is not what this is," Julian said, his voice a low growl. "Ilara saved my life. So you reward her with a fancy title and a corner office?" Amelia's father, Robert, spoke for the first time, his voice heavy with sorrow. "We understand gratitude, Julian. But this is a betrayal of our daughter's memory. It's unseemly." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at these 2 people, their faces etched with grief and judgment, and she finally understood. To them and to the world, she would never be anything more than the maid who got lucky. She would always be an intruder in Amelia's world, a stain on her memory. And her presence at Julian's side was not a source of strength for him, but a source of pain and scandal. She couldn't do this to him. The man she had saved, the man she was beginning to care for deeply, deserved better than to have his life constantly scrutinized and his late wife's memory dishonored because of her. Later that night, after the tense and painful meeting had ended, she found Julian staring out the penthouse window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Don't listen to them," he said without turning around. "They're grieving. They don't know what they're saying." "They do, Julian," Ilara said softly, her heart aching. "They see what everyone else sees. And they're not entirely wrong." He turned to face her, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "I can't do this anymore," she said, the words feeling like shards of glass in her throat. "The stories, the whispers, the way they look at you, because of me. You've just gotten your life back. You shouldn't have to spend it fighting a new battle for my honor. You deserve peace." "My peace is with you," he said, his voice raw. "Is it?" she challenged, her eyes welling with tears. "Or am I just a constant living reminder of the worst year of your life? Of Isabella, of David, of Amelia's death? You need a fresh start, a clean slate. And I'm not that." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy black keycard and the ornate brass keys. She walked to the small table beside him and placed them down. The sound they made was quiet, but it echoed in the room like a final, definitive judgment. "I'm resigning, Julian," she said, her voice breaking, "as your chief of staff, and as whatever this is between us. I'm giving you back your city. Find someone worthy of it." Before he could react, before he could say a word to stop her, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the silent penthouse with the keys to his world lying between them. She walked out of the life she had stumbled into, believing it was the only way to truly save the man she had come to love.